In the winter of 1805, a young girl had a dream that one day there would be a church near her Northern Virginia home, perhaps at the crossroads of her rural community, Lewinsville. She'd be a member there, of course, of that she was sure. In her dream, 19-year-old Elizabeth Jones envisioned the church as
a simple little chapel placed in the woods near Barrett's Crossroads. A proper place for a young lady to attend church.
While she waited for her dream to be realized, Elizabeth attended services at Georgetown Presbyterian and occasional services with her family at Salona, the McLean home of the Reverend William Maffett. But Salona wasn't the chapel of her dreams. Her older brother Thomas, a Navy lieutenant, would be no help. Not now. He supported her desire for a church, but was away defending New Orleans in the War of 1812. Elizabeth's family was not without resources. They inherited a large portion of the nearly 3,500 acres given to the George Turberville family by Lord Fairfax in 1742. Elizabeth's share of the land was more than 100 acres, most of it on the southern border of the Turberville property. That's where she was determined to build a church. Alas, Elizabeth died in 1822, her dream unfulfilled. But in her will, she set aside
4 acres as a site for a church and churchyard dedicated to the uses and purposes of divine worship in such manner and subject to such rules as shall be prescribed by the Reverend William Maffett.
Just as it seemed the church might finally become a reality, the courts stepped in. Unfortunately, Elizabeth had conditioned her bequest on satisfying the debts left by her alcoholic Uncle Troilus. Immediately, creditors demanded to be compensated from Elizabeth's estate. 20 years later, Elizabeth's brother Thomas, now a Commodore, and his aunt, Martha Turberville Ball, settled all debts of Troilus, and with 17 hardy souls, they established Elizabeth Jones Church at Barrett's Crossroads. The date, October 17th, 1846. The little chapel was built in standard meeting hall fashion. Members were greeted by 2 rows of plain wooden pews separated by a center aisle. 3 triple-sash windows with hand-blown glass, nearly 9 feet tall, provided enough light for singing hymns a cappella. No organ of any kind in the beginning. A small gas lamp on the pulpit provided light for the pastor to read scripture. The first pastor was Reverend Levi Christian, and somehow they managed to pay him the princely sum of $200 per year. Parishioners welcomed Reverend Christian with a comfortable manse, built with the labor and skill of his new flock. By the time Reverend B.F. Bittinger was called in 1852, those first 17 members had more than tripled their numbers. The congregation welcomed the new pastor with a friendship quilt containing the names of all members, each written in indelible ink. A dedication on the edge of the quilt records the date as May 30th, 1852. With youth included, there were 108 names. Many asked for the name of their farm or plantation to be included. Commodore Jones insisted that USN be added next to his name. Due to its fragile condition, the quilt is no longer displayed. When Reverend C.B. McKee arrived from Baltimore in 1857, he continued his habit of keeping a daily record of his activities in a personal diary. Once he recorded,
I preached to 70 souls today, black and white. 11 are black.
His diary reflects the life of a man who considered himself quite poor, a man who owned neither horse nor carriage. Indeed, he borrowed frequently from church members and supplemented his income by teaching children of the community, $10 per child per quarter. McKee also performed medical services for those in need and often dispensed something he called the brown mixture. The recipe for his cure-all was handwritten on the front of his diary. Shake well always before using. Membership grew to 83 in just 2 short years. When the winds of war began to stir, Reverend McKee, whose sentiments were with the South, was asked to leave. Whatever promise the little church enjoyed in its early days was cut short by the first shots fired in the Civil War. One of the early skirmishes in Virginia took place less than a mile from the church. The Battle of Lewinsville, as it came to be called, took place September 11, 1861. Both sides claimed victory, but in the end, Union forces pulled back. 2 weeks later, another skirmish took place, this one on the grounds of the church itself. A Union soldier described the engagement in a letter to his family in Ohio.
We're in a graveyard by a church in Lewinsville. The enemy's artillery has our range perfectly. The bombs are bursting about us with a vim, and I'm lying so close to the ground that even an Indiana court could not divide us. J. Thomas Petty, Sentinel.
During the 2 years that Union troops occupied church grounds, weatherboarding was stripped from the church, as well as pulpit furniture and pews. After the war, the church sought reparations for damages sustained by the occupation. One local farmer, a member of Lewinsville Church, testified before the claims court.
Well, everybody knew Union troops kept their horses in the church. I saw it myself. So much weatherboarding had been removed, horses could be taken in and out from any direction, and were. James McGarity, farmer.
And although the accounting was submitted in a timely fashion, it took 38 years to verify the church's allegiance to the Union. The petition was finally granted, and the church awarded $1,907.84. Years of struggle followed after the war, but somehow the members managed to seed 3 other churches in the area, including Vienna Presbyterian in 1871, First Presbyterian of Arlington in 1872, and Falls Church Presbyterian in 1874. Despite the best efforts of its pastors, membership at Lewinsville was no more than 24 by 1923. Many thought the trolley line that ran from Georgetown through the middle of McLean to Great Falls would bring needed growth to the church at Lewinsville. But it didn't. Worship services were so poorly attended that the elders decided to take a vote on whether or not to close its doors permanently. On the day of the scheduled vote, Dr. Harvey J. Dunham, pastor of Washington's Western Presbyterian Church, traveled out to Lewinsville to preach and preside over the vote. But the vote never took place. In the middle of Dr. Dunham's sermon, the pipe from the potbelly stove fell, spewing soot and ash over everyone. As they ran into the church yard, one of the elders said the incident was a sign that they should stay, and so they did. Dr. Dunham was asked to serve as stated supply. By the end of 1927, outward migration from Washington forced Lewinsville to build its first educational building. They named it Dunham Hall, in honor of the pastor and his wife who helped breathe new life into the church at a critical point in its history. When Dr. Dunham retired in 1939, Lewinsville decided it was time to hire a full-time pastor. They chose a freshly minted Princeton graduate, Franklin Brown Gillespie. The Ladies' Aid pledged to raise the money every year to pay his salary of $1,800. Through the war years, the church continued to grow, as did the Gillespie family. By 1945, Dunham Hall, thought to be sufficient for 100 years, was suddenly too small. Their solution? Increase the height of Dunham Hall by 1 full floor, thus to permit 7 new classrooms where the basement had been. The old manse, restored after the Civil War, was replaced in the late 1940s with a modern bungalow. 3 successive pastors and their families called the manse home in the 1950s. America was changing in dramatic ways after World War II. Veterans were coming home, getting married, buying cars, and moving to the suburbs where they created new communities on land that for decades had served as dairy farms. Television brought the rest of the world into their homes every night, and man-made satellites opened eyes on a world dominated by ever-advancing technology. Sleepy little churches suddenly found themselves growing at a frenetic pace. When membership passed 547 in 1954, the congregation urged the session to finish plans for a new sanctuary.
You had to grow, but you didn't want to.
But first they had to decide what to do with the original church. Some didn't want to give it up. Heated debate almost tore the church apart. In the end, they decided to keep the chapel but move it to one side of the property. That was before the termites voted. Architects determined the damage to be so severe that the little chapel might collapse if an attempt were made to move it. Sadly and carefully, the white frame church was disassembled in late 1955. Finally, nothing remained except the front steps and a bit of the stone foundation. One of those beautiful 9-foot windows went to Evans Farm and became a window in the inn's dining room. Several pews were sold to members. Some of the support beams were salvaged and set aside for future use. 25 years later, when a cross was installed on the front lawn of the present-day church, it was crafted entirely from 2 wooden beams saved from the 1846 church. Dr. Howard Newman was the pastor when work began on the new sanctuary in 1956. Elder Clemens Stone, Dr. Newman, and historian Frank Gapp laid the cornerstone in May 1956. And construction began in earnest shortly thereafter. When the new building was finished and dedicated, it was large enough to comfortably accommodate 340 persons. But the growth was far from over. It was just getting started. When Reverend John Graham arrived in 1957, his highest priority was building a new educational building. Dunham Hall had served the church well for 35 years, but no longer met its needs. It was sold to Bayard Evans for $1 and moved next door to Evans Farm, where it became a gift shop. Money was raised for a new educational building, and construction got underway in 1961. The church was quickly adapting to meet the needs of a fast-growing community, but there was more, much more to be done. In 1966, Lewinsville trustees took a first option on the Eglin home and grounds next door and paid the estate of the late Colonel Eglin a little over $91,000 for its 4 acres. A year went by as the church began a long process of trying to decide its best use. The first committee could not reach a consensus, so it was disbanded and a new committee appointed. The second committee decided a home for the elderly should be built on the site. Planning began, but before a spade of dirt could be turned, a major change in leadership took place. Reverend John Graham, who had been at Lewinsville for more than a decade, was near the end of his tenure in 1968, when the church called an associate pastor, Reverend Gary Pinder. Pinder began a ministry that became the longest tenure in the history of Lewinsville, 37 years. Pinder was soon joined by a new senior pastor, Reverend Bill Tatum. Together, they provided the leadership for Lewinsville's most ambitious project to date, construction of an affordable retirement home on the Eglin property next door. After years of planning, ground was finally broken in May 1979 for the Lewinsville Retirement Residence, LRR as it came to be known. Marie Lewis provided crucial lay leadership during the entire process. The residence opened in September 1980, already at full capacity. With the addition of the retirement home, Lewinsville's presence at the corner of Great Falls and Chainbridge Road nearly doubled in size, as was evident in this 1983 aerial view. Another expansion, Lewinsville East, was added to LRR in 2003. And today, the expanded complex is home to 175 residents. Reverend Deborah McKinley was called in 2008 and immediately began to seek new ways to extend Lewinsville's mission into the surrounding community. Among those initiatives was the creation of an interfaith coalition established to meet the needs of a burgeoning population in the nearby Tysons Urban Center. Lewinsville's annual summer mission project began in the late 1980s when the church sent out its first group of youth and adults to help the people of the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in South Dakota. SMP, as it is known today, sends 50 youth and adults on an annual trip to areas of the nation in need of willing hands to build, repair, and renovate. They went to New Orleans to assist in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, and to New Jersey to help Hurricane Sandy victims, and to many places in between.
Praise God from whom all blessings flow. Praise God, all creatures here below.
Of course, there is more to Lewinsville's mission ministry than winter and summer work trips. Lewinsville is involved in nearly 100 mission projects beyond its doors every year, from a school in Thailand to a medical mission in Papua New Guinea. And back home, from Share to Homestretch, Boost the Troops to Stop Hunger Now, and Good Samaritan Day. By 1986, Lewinsville's membership was well above 850. Serious talk of another expansion of the physical plant was in the air. Some 300 families pledged $1.3 million in 1989 to expand the sanctuary, enlarge the narthex, install an elevator, renovate church offices, and build a separate music department. Much of the credit for the success of the music ministry must go to Jay Clark, a gifted musician who arrived in 1967. Every aspect of the music program grew under Jay's leadership. At one time, 160 persons participated in 11 choral and handbell choirs. When Jay retired in 2004, Dr. Ed Moore was called, and for 7 years, he built upon the work of Jay Clark. And every time there's been a change in music leadership, Carol Houston has been there, expert with baton and keyboard, ready to step in and continue Lewinsville's standard of musical excellence. Today, Carol is Director of Music Ministries. When CE Director Susan Seahaver arrived in 1993, she instituted the workshop rotation model as the curriculum for youth in grades 1 through 6. Her rotation model has been adopted by Presbyterian churches nationwide. Allison Lineberger followed and continued the teaching example of the CE leaders who preceded her, often employing unorthodox methods. Reverend Emily Berman DeAndrea arrived in 2002 as Associate Pastor for Christian Formation. Beyond her extraordinary personal ministry with parishioners, Emily has left her mark on nearly every aspect of missional outreach and community service. The stories of Christian formation are part of Lewinsville's history, and they represent a continuing ministry, but it is impossible to describe them all here. We have not mentioned the opening in 2007 of Chesterbrook Residences, an assisted living facility established by Lewinsville in partnership with Temple Rodef Shalom and Emmanuel Presbyterian Church. We have not mentioned the Reformed Institute, established by Lewinsville in 2002 to teach the Reformed tradition to each new generation. Nor have we mentioned the many active Christ Care groups in the church, or early pastoral callers who later became our first Stephen ministers, whose services today include providing extended communion to the homes of those unable to attend church. The programs are diverse, the opportunities to serve many. But this is a history of Lewinsville, not a summary of current events and current activities in the life of the church. This story is about the pilgrims and pioneers who came before us. Those pilgrims, those pioneers in the faith, were always asking, what new, what better, what else can we do to serve our God and our brothers and sisters in the world God has placed in our stewardship? What can we do to be more like Chuck Sheffey, whose skilled hands left physical evidence of his many gifts throughout the church? Or Howard Saltzman, whose lecture series helped us engage the world in long overdue conversations? Or Marie Lewis, whose passion for building the Lewinsville retirement residence overcame every obstacle? Or Dr. Mark Andrews, parish associate, whose life was a walking reflection of what it means to be formed and living in the image of Christ. These are the Christian pilgrims Reverend Franklin Gillespie had in mind when he reflected on Lewinsville's history at our 140th anniversary in 1986.
We must always be pilgrims and pioneers in the faith, those who are out ahead, blazing new trails, paving the way for those who will follow.
The only question remaining is, where does the trail lead from here? The answer lies within the hearts and minds of those willing to pick up the mantle of Elizabeth Jones, willing to make her passion their own, and blaze new trails. For that is our heritage. That is our future. Thus may it always be for Elizabeth Jones' simple little chapel placed in the woods near Barrett's Crossroads.